With day one starting around 6:30 a.m., there would be no shortage of trains over the next several days. A southbound loaded crude oil train was already coming down the CSX Pittsburgh subdivision within 20 minutes of our arrival at the waterfront in Homestead, Pennsylvania. Homestead would be a namesake stopping point throughout the duration of this trip, and this is where we would stake out the majority of our first morning trackside and even a little bit into the early afternoon. Like many places I'm familiar with back home in Tennessee and even my old turf in Texas, Homestead has an old depot smack in the middle of town just off the waterfront, centered between two heavily active Norfolk Southern and CSX main lines, both of which we would cover rather extensively throughout the duration of our stay. In regards to our first train of the trip, I didn't catch the symbol as we jump right into the action, but I would like to guess that judging by his extensive cut of crude oil tankers, that he came from the BNSF interchange at Cicero, Illinois, although I can't say for sure. Located towards the top of the Monongahela River in the eastern suburbs of Pittsburgh, Homestead is an old but loud town for local and out-of-state rail fans, with great train action and a multitude of Class 1 railroads providing a wide variety of power, with origins and destinations in Chicagoland on both sides. For those who come here not in search of trains like myself, and come to find out many others during my stay, Homestead also has a wide plethora of shopping centers, restaurants, entertainment districts, and even a water park just on the west side of town for little ones to cool off in the water on hot summer days like these. We would utilize the depot for our first few trains of the morning, set up right across the street from the Rogue Barbecue Shack and the Aldi grocery store on the opposite side of the tracks. And it wouldn't be long after the CSX's rear marker lights got by that a red signal dropped on the Norfolk Southern side down on their middle track, indicating that eastbound trains were on the way. We'll get into the signal aspects here in a little bit, but for now, sit back and enjoy this Norfolk Southern stack train headed east down the waterfront. I didn't catch the symbol on this one either, but judging by the cut of international port containers at the bottom end, I believe that this was train 256, daily intermodal from Chicago, Illinois to Croxton, New Jersey, although I can't say for sure. I also wouldn't catch it on camera, but as this train's bottom end rolled past the triple track signal bridge, the far outside track also dropped to red, meaning that there was a second eastbound not too far behind this one's rear marker lights. And the wait would only be about 20 minutes for another train to come rolling down, but not what we were expecting. Up from the south, back on the CSX side, would be train M277, daily autoracks from Twin Oaks, Pennsylvania to Louisville, Kentucky. This was a pretty easy train to identify, all things considered, especially with the fact that it was not a duplicate bulk unit train, both sides of which see plenty of on a day-to-day basis. That and there's simply not a lot of solid autorack traffic on either side, with only 2 to 4 trains gracing them would give this one away. As we would come to find out throughout the day-to-day and the rest of our trip, CSX trains in either direction can sneak up on you, assuming one is in search of Norfolk Southern trains and vice versa. At least in the days that I was here, I had it happen quite a bit on both sides. Highway traffic would be able to cross the tracks after its bottom end got by, but only for a few minutes, as down from Pittsburgh came NS eastbound 258, sporting a foreign Union Pacific visitor. .258 is daily intermodal traffic on a multi-day eastbound run from Kansas City, Missouri to Rutherford, Pennsylvania. I've heard this train to run with all intermodal and combo intermodal and autoracks, as he was the latter today. In any case, we found out pretty quickly why Norfolk Southern runs their intermodals along the Monongahela line from Duquesne around the south side of Pittsburgh. Because of environmental emission concerns and lack of height clearance to accommodate the higher double stacks and tri-level autoracks, they are forced to route down across the Monongahela River at Duquesne and back across the Ohio River past downtown Pittsburgh. Plans have been in the works for years about increasing the height clearance under bridges so Norfolk Southern can shift their trains through downtown. But as aforementioned, with environmental emission concerns around the local public, I personally don't see it happening anytime soon. After the last car of 258 got by us, it would reveal a high green on the middle track, full speed ahead, although this doesn't necessarily tell you everywhere that a train is coming. From what I've learned back home on the C&O and TP, Norfolk Southern intermediate signals can line trains up to 4 signal blocks away. However, when there are no trains running, the signals will default to one aspect or another, oftentimes yellow over red, indicating an approach. So seeing anything other than red on these intermediates doesn't always tell you that a train is coming, but I knew one was. Only a few more minutes before the positive red lights began flashing, but once again, another northbound CSX catching us by surprise. This giant string of .117 tank cars hauled by a solo CSX ET44AH sort of looks to be a counterpart to the loaded train we saw earlier, although I didn't catch an exact symbol for either. And a lot of the bulk unit trains on this line are duplicates, so I can't exactly look for a counterpart symbol and take a guess. All I can say is this one was empty rather than loaded. And what do you know? Before we knew it, the morning rush of rail traffic was well upon the Homestead waterfront. Within only 5 minutes of the oil drag's rear markers getting by, Norfolk Southern Hotshot 23G was calling signals east of us upon crossing the Monongahela River and was thundering by the old restored depot within minutes. .23G is daily high-priority intermodal traffic from Croxton, New Jersey to Chicago, Illinois. Norfolk Southern runs several of these trains in both directions on a day-to-day basis, and we'll come to see quite an assortment of such throughout the rest of our time in Pittsburgh and across central Pennsylvania later in the week. These UPS trains to and from Croxton are some of the highest priority trains on this stretch of line on Norfolk Southern in either direction, and as aforementioned, we'll be seeing a lot more of them throughout our stay. But in regards to the here and now, this train would end just as quickly as it came. And up from the south a short time later, once again on the CSX side, would be another bulk unit train. And we actually did get the symbol for this one. It turned out to be B157, the infamous Coke Express from nearby Braddock, Pennsylvania to the Canadian National Interchange at Gary, Indiana. This is an interesting train to me, as I knew there was a chance I would see at least one and kind of hoped to do so while I was out here. And lucky for me, I would end up achieving that. But come to find out very quickly that it would be far from the only interesting move I would see throughout the duration of my stay. After the bottom end of B157 got by, I would swing out east to nearby Wilmerding on the opposite side of the river. I was hearing hints of an 18N coming east, and radio chatter on my drive over from Homestead would confirm my suspicions. And the wait would only be about 15 to 20 minutes before our eastbound train rolled up on CP Wing. Solid autoracks with a solo AC44C6M on the front and another ES44AC down at the rear. On an eastbound run from Bellevue, Ohio, 18N is daily autoracks for Newark, New Jersey. We actually saw the head power upon just getting out of Homestead while we were already making course for Wilmerding, so we figured we'd leapfrog ahead to Wilmerding to find a better shot to fire off. 18N seems to be pretty 50-50 with their power assortments, sometimes 2 up front and nothing at the bottom or middle, or 1 front, 1 rear or middle, though he was the latter today. In any case, these autoracks would be on their way, and so would we. So we'd let the 18N go further east, and we'd make our way back to Homestead from here, as more eastbound trains were still on the way. After driving from Wilmerding back to Homestead, we got stuck at the Amity Street crossing behind NS eastbound 26X, a train that I'm somewhat familiar with. Daily intermodal traffic from Los Angeles, California via the BNSF Norfolk Southern interchange at Chicago to Croxton, New Jersey. Every now and then I would see this train from the side of Highway 22 on a state college trip with my dad or something similar, but now I'm actually on the NS line that they run all the way across Pennsylvania, so I'll get to see this guy almost every day while I'm up here. With loads of UPS and other high-priority containers and trailers, 26X trumps the priority of almost every other train on the Pittsburgh line, with some trains being held up for hours just to keep this one moving, despite the line being largely double-tracked all the way. At least in the days that I was here, I heard it happen a time or two. They actually sidelined our next train on the side of Mount Washington to let this one by, pushing its arrival into Homestead to almost noon. What train was that? Oh, I don't know. It was a Norfolk Southern coal train of some kind or another. I've heard that the Pittsburgh and Monongahela lines tend to get a lot of these, and I can attest after being in Pennsylvania that they do. But the one thing that they all have in common is they largely have similar origin and destination points, with the exception of a couple oddball shuttles, as we'll come to discover later in the trip. Though we would be thrown a bone here in Homestead with this one oddball drag. I immediately recognized the TVAX markings on each car, which leads me to believe that this train is either coming up from or headed down to the TVA Kingston power plant back near my home base in Kingston, Tennessee, thus leading me to believe that this was either 896 or 897. Despite the high volume train action and the fact that it was only 12 p.m., this would be our last train of day number 1. I had already made plans to see my dad and relative family down the road in Washington for the afternoon, so we'd hit the road for there, and I would take Monday away from the tracks to spend one more day with family while I was still close to them. But with 5 additional days still left to work with, we would have plenty of time to get out and explore the remainder of the trip. So Tuesday would be another day. And welcome back. After taking a day off on Monday to spend one last day with family, we would be back out by the tracks once again the following day to do some more exploring around both the CSX and Norfolk Southern along the Ohio River. We would begin day number 2 before sunrise back along the CSX in Monaca, located to the northwest of downtown Pittsburgh along the Ohio River. After a roughly 20-minute wait for the first train of the day, a northbound bulk unit train comes rolling across the Ohio River Bridge. I didn't catch the symbol for this one, but I did recognize the Coke Express hoppers from the B-157 we saw back in Homestead the other day. So unless that train is classified as something else past Coriopolis for some reason, this is likely B-157, and a pretty hefty cut of mixed freight this time in comparison to the last one we saw back on day 1. A fairly decent-sized train these 2 engines would be hauling across the Ohio River, but with the sun beginning to rise, we would begin shifting back and forth across the river several times on our southbound run back towards Homestead. With the sun finally up, we'd start out at Norfolk Southern's Conway Hump Yard, one of the largest, most active, and vital humps on the network, easily sitting up with the likes of Elkhart, Indiana, Bellevue, Ohio, and Chattanooga, Tennessee, just to name a few. Conway handles a large majority of the manifest freight throughout the Northeast, Midwest, and even into the Southeast United States, and is always filled with constant yard switching moves, car humping and kicking, and of course, the hefty hustle and bustle of heavy haul mainline freight action throughout the day and night hours. Starting here along the banks of the mighty Ohio River, we see Manifest Train 11V pulling into the yard upon their final approach for termination, sporting, unsurprisingly, some BNSF power. Not sure what's been afoot at the Norfolk Southern Power Desk this year, but even reports from local rail fans have stated that foreign power on the Pittsburgh line has been ubiquitous throughout almost all of 2026. Likely because most of the traffic that runs this line runs through interchanges with the Union Pacific, BNSF, and other various railroads around Chicagoland. Every now and then we'll see something else, but at least from my experience, BNSF seems to be the most frequent foreign visitor. "11V is daily manifest freight from Enola, Pennsylvania to Conway, and a fairly short train as these guys had a pretty light and easy run over the Pittsburgh line with their 3 head-end locomotives. As I lightly mentioned earlier, Conway is one of the most active and vital rail hubs on the entire Norfolk Southern network, and there's hardly ever a dull moment here. As our 11V arrives at Conway, one can faintly see an eastbound intermodal has just pulled into the yard for a crew change, while Manifest Train 32A is finishing assembling their own train for a fresh departure eastward simultaneously. Once the bottom end of 11V got into the yard, we would swing further down south along Ohio River Boulevard to the town of Leetsdale, and I chose this spot because I knew of the high speeds that the trains would make through here. I also knew that the intermodal would be leaving soon, and given the speed limit through Leetsdale, I wanted to see something pound the control point. The brief stop in at Leetsdale would yield us a high green, full speed ahead on track 1, and only a few minutes later, around the corner came our headlight, solid UPS and other high-priority containers and trailers. I didn't catch the symbol on this one, but judging by the time of day, I would like to believe this was either 20H or 22M, both with Chicago origins, with 20H destined for Harrisburg and 22M destined for Morrisville, Pennsylvania. And I'm not sure if their shipment was late or someone in the cab had to use the bathroom upon getting out of Conway, but these 2 GE builds were wide open and their train was full track speed through the crossovers. This would be a new one for me. Not the motive power or rolling stock or even the location, but rather a heavy haul freight train pounding a set of switches up close and at speed. Leetsdale is one of the few spots around the Pittsburgh area where trains are actually able to really open up. A small stretch between Leetsdale and Glenfield a little ways further down the river. Track speed through these few towns on the way between Conway and Pittsburgh is roughly 60 miles an hour. So I definitely felt the want to see at least one train up here hitting full speed. With loads of UPS and other high-priority containers and trailers hauled by 2 big Norfolk Southern GEs, these guys would have no problem keeping this one moving. Once the bottom end of this train got by, we considered swinging down towards Coraopolis on the opposite side of the river. I was hearing hints of an I-136 coming down the CSX side, but some additional radio chatter back on the Norfolk Southern side and some intuition would tell me to stay on the NS, so I would stick out at Edgeworth for the next few trains. And just as I had finished setting myself up, bam, I-136 was poking through the trees on the west banks of the Ohio River. I-136 is daily intermodal port containers from Chicago's 59th Street Yard to Suffolk, Virginia, and a couple of unmistakable big blue GE wide cab builds gracing the lead of this one, and a hefty string of both 53-foot domestic and 20, 40, and 45-foot international overseas shipping containers. Unlike the Union Pacific and BNSF I've grown more acquainted with out west, CSX and Norfolk Southern traditionally run their loaded trains eastbound as opposed to west. This is because they both operate largely to the east of the Mississippi River, and all of their major ports reside on the Atlantic coast like New York City and Norfolk, Virginia, just to name a few of the big ones. Almost immediately after the bottom end of I-136 slipped by, a loaded bulk unit grain train back on our side of the river sporting some BNSF run-through power thunders downbound on track 1, and a lot of BNSF rolling stock on this one. The grain train in question would be NS-48A, as aforementioned sporting some BNSF run-through power and a large string of loaded down BNSF grain hoppers, thus giving away the idea that this train likely came from somewhere on the BNSF, and a Norfolk Southern AC-44C6M would be slapped on the head console somewhere in Chicago. Go ahead and place this train in the back of your mind for now, because we'll see it again later in the trip in central Pennsylvania running empty. I had almost completely forgotten about that 32A by this point, because my attention had largely shifted towards the aforementioned 48A and I-136. And creeping down from the west on track 2 would be our 32A, headed by a solo SD70 ACE with another AC-44C6M somewhere in the middle. 32A is daily manifest freight from Conway to King of Prussia, Pennsylvania, located in the northwestern suburbs of Philadelphia. A lot of miscellaneous Reading and Northern rolling stock on this one, and simply seeing the wide variety of rolling stock from different companies such as Reading and Northern, Cairo Trans, Norfolk Southern, and even a little bit of Chicago and Northwestern in between just goes to show you the rather cool and interesting assortment of stock these trains can pile up. Cairo Trans was North America's largest private owner of refrigerated and insulated rail cars. Acquired by cold chain logistics giant Lineage, the fleet includes over 2,200 rail cars used primarily to transport bulk frozen goods like French fries and other temperature-sensitive perishables across the continent. And the key word there is was, because the company was acquired by Lineage Cold Chain Logistics back in 2021. Either way, Lineage and Cairo Trans both use the same 72-foot refrigerated and insulated rail cars to haul similar refrigerated and frozen goods from point A to point B. I'd even see a select handful of both on this train, among the wide variety of other general industrial goods. In any case, 48A and 32A were off and running, and so we'd now make our way to the opposite side of the river at Coraopolis. At Coraopolis, there's a few noticeable things. A borderline street running scene with the residential and industrial streets right next to the tracks, the old restored depot, and the signals under a highway bridge. These signals are guarding the north end of the double track out of Pittsburgh, and so this is where the single track main running south doubles up for some several miles into the south side of Pittsburgh. We would stop here because even though the I-136 was now long gone, I was hearing hints of another southbound not too far away, and the stop into town revealing a limited clear facing my direction would confirm my prior suspicions. A limited clear meaning limited speeds through turnouts, crossovers, sidings, and power-operated switches, and once fully diverged, they can proceed at maximum authorized speed. Only a few minutes later, around the corner came our headlight, and surprise, surprise, another lengthy manifest freight. The southbound in question would be M420, a daily manifest freight train from Willard, Ohio to Cumberland, Maryland. He works a multitude of yards, such explaining why it took so long to get down to us. That and crew shortages can also make for a plethora of delays, but not something we ain't used to back home in the volunteer state. Today's M420 would be sporting a pair of big blue CSX General Electric Evolution Series motors, still wearing their original Yellow Nose 3 paint, or YN3 for short, from the days of when they were first manufactured in the early to mid 2000s. And as the cherry on top was Canadian National SD75I number 5644, making for a rather interesting consist, especially with the power desk being rather dry back home in Nashville in comparison to usual. We would unexpectedly find this train again later, as going without saying by now, they are diverging onto Main 2 upon entering the double track. They would evidently be sidelined for a series of northbound trains before they could continue any further south. Though with nothing else on the immediate radar for CSX, we'd shift back across the river once more to the town of Emsworth. Setting up at the Buzzy's Corner just off the Ohio River Dam located here, we would see not one, not two, not three, but 4 trains in less than 30 minutes, and first in line was southbound local freight C35. C35 is daily road local traffic from Conway to Shire Oaks, Pennsylvania, and perhaps some locomotive overkill on this relatively short train. These guys would have a pretty easy run down the Monongahela line. Also just coming into view down from the opposite direction at the same time was Norfolk Southern Hotshot 23G running westbound, so I already knew I was set to have a meet right in front of me. What I didn't know in the moment was that a second eastbound train was already right at the doorstep as well, right on the heels of the C35, and just like that, a cover-up, and a near-perfect three-way meet. If you're not familiar with the term cover-up, I'll go ahead and explain it quickly. It's pretty self-explanatory, but a cover-up in this case is when a train from the front blocks another one behind it, and this would be far from the only time we would have such happen on my stay. To put into perspective just how busy this Norfolk Southern artery truly is, I had never seen 4 freights in a 30-minute span anywhere, let alone on a single rail line, so this would be another new one for me. Either way, the second eastbound in question was 18N, the same autorack train we saw over in Wilmerding back on day 1, and this time with 2 engines on the front and none anywhere else in comparison to the one from the other day. As I lightly touched on a second ago, this is part of Norfolk Southern's most vital rail artery, connecting Chicagoland to the northeastern United States. And we'll see throughout the week just how active and vital it truly is throughout our time in central Pennsylvania later on. But in regards to us in the here and now, these 3 trains were gone just as quickly as they got here. We were fixing to shift back across the river to the CSX side once again upon hearing more northbound trains on the way. But down from the west within another 20 minutes came a loaded crude oil train, one that I didn't catch the symbol on, but sporting a Kansas City Southern SD70 ACE trailing in the second position. With nothing else on the immediate radar on either side, we would make our way back into Pittsburgh's south side next to Station Square. Parking in the lot next to the Three Rivers Heritage Trail along the southern banks of the Monongahela River, we would make the roughly 10 to 15 minute hike on foot to a spot that I wanted to try. But alas, there really wasn't much going on when we got here. So we'd set up on the platform over the main line, and it was still almost an hour before anything showed up on either side. This, I believe, L164 would be the train to finally break the silence on this Monday afternoon. But once it was gone, it was gone. And I mean that because once it got by, there were hardly any mainline trains on either side again. Or so I thought. We'd stick it out another 30 minutes or so before our northbound train of the day. And I chose to come shoot it down here upon knowing what was on it because this was one of the spots I found on maps that I wanted to see something at while I was in town. Northbound Autorack train M277 cruises through Pittsburgh's south side with CSX ES44AH number 1899, the Père Marquette Heritage Unit gracing the lead. M277, as lightly mentioned back on day 1, is daily Autoracks from Twin Oaks, Pennsylvania to Louisville, Kentucky. This would be my first Heritage Unit of the trip, and come to discover over the next several days, it certainly would not be the last. Seeing one of these so early in the trip was quite refreshing, and especially considering, as aforementioned, how unusually dry the CSX Power Desk has been back on my new home turf in Nashville, Tennessee. With these solid Autoracks clear of Station Square, we would now start making the hike back down to the truck. We don't quite make it back, as some radio chatter and some intuition would tell me to stay put at the ground level crossing for a few more minutes. And down from the north came a familiar face. Manifest Freight M420, the same M420 we'd seen earlier back at Coriopolis, catching us by total surprise. Seeing this M420 for a second time by surprise was certainly interesting to say the least, albeit this would be the last of this train that we would see. From here, we'd set course back to Homestead for the rest of the afternoon and into the evening, as there's supposedly a little bit of an evening rush that happens here, usually about 5 to 6 trains that are often daily runners. First in line was this intriguing power set running long hood forward, or for a lack of a better term, Southern style, with a rather interesting power set. A C40-8 wide cab build, and a flared SD70 Mac. Following only 15 minutes behind the aforementioned light power shuttle is empty crude oil train B122 headed northbound up the waterfront. They would be carrying kind of what I had feared would happen at some point on this trip. A lash up of solid orange BNSF pumpkins had slipped their way into the CSX power pool. And although it's foreign power up here in Pennsylvania, I have seen beyond my share of these nacho cheese Doritos in my time around the hobby, especially after living in Texas for 13 years and still being unable to escape them back at my new home in Tennessee. In any case, however, this solid BNSF lash-up gives away the idea that this train is likely destined for the BNSF interchange at Cicero, Illinois. Where BNSF would take the train beyond that, however, remains a mystery and also none of my concern, so long as I've documented it and it's on my SD card. As you can see here, we've been met with a cover-up for the second time today. Now remember how I made mention that depending on which side you're more focused on, how something else from the opposite side can sneak up on you? Remember how that happened a few times back on day one? Yeah, go figure it would happen again here, just the other way around. This time it would be CSX that we were primarily focused on and not Norfolk Southern, though a likely empty Norfolk Southern coal train would sneak up on us as the rear of this B122 was getting up out of town. I didn't catch a symbol on the coal train, go figure, but given the fact that a lot of the coal trains on Norfolk Southern out here have very similar origins and destinations, of course with the exception of that TVA Kingston coal train we saw back on day one, this train is likely bound for either the Shire Oaks Yard or Bailey Mine, both of which are much further south down the Monongahela River. In any case, this was the start of the evening rush. Setting up on the side of the high-level Homestead Grace Bridge, we would see 2 more trains for the night, and 25G was the first in line. Remember how I mentioned earlier that Norfolk Southern runs several intermodals between Chicago and Croxton on a daily basis, and most of them run UPS carloads? Yeah, this would be another one of those. 25G is another iteration of the Croxton to Chicago hotshots, running more UPS and other high-priority carloads worth of freight. And simply seeing all of these FedEx, Amazon, and UPS brands, along with other high-priority containers and trailers, it kind of gives away the idea that they're carrying something that's got somewhere to be, and quickly, with a deadline. But in regards to us, this train would leave just as quickly as it got here, and right behind them would be 25P, with more Chicago-bound UPS carloads, this time from Morrisville, Pennsylvania, with one of Norfolk Southern's Sonic bonnets number 4002 trailing in the number 2 slot. This would be a nice end to day number 2. Another quick note to add, all of the refrigerated and insulated trailers and containers throughout these trains, carrying frozen and other bulk temperature-sensitive perishable commodities, likely destined for cold chain industries and warehouses via highway truckload. But at least in the case of hotshot intermodal commerce like this, that gets addressed once the containers and trailers get unloaded at their rail destination and sent back on the interstate highway network, where they will then be delivered to said industry or warehouse where they'll be unloaded. Just think for a second with this train, how many trucks are taken off of our roads to move these goods faster and at a much higher volume for a fraction of the fuel and total price. And that should be all the proof you need, whether you care enough to admit it or not, that the railroads are the central backbone of the American economy. This 25P, though, would close the lid on day number 2, and we would be off and running back to Cannonsburg for the night, so I could grab all my stuff from the house and load everything into my truck for the remainder of the trip. But tomorrow, down towards the Mason-Dixon, was another day. And we're back out nice and early once again after a super early departure from Cannonsburg. The next morning would ironically bring us to one of the most southern points we would visit on this trip, walking down the trails to Falls Cut Tunnel on the outside of Fairhope, Pennsylvania. Falls Cut was another one of those locations I found on maps that I knew I wanted to see something at. More specifically, something coming eastbound out of the tunnel, as it's very quiet and peaceful back here, and definitely scenic. This spot sits along the eastern side of the famous CSX Sand Patch Grade, also part of the Keystone subdivision, though it is still part of the same main line up to the widely sprawling Metropolitan Pittsburgh area where we just were for the first few days. We would stake it out down here for much longer than I wanted to, as I knew I had to see something coming eastbound out of the tunnel, as I lightly mentioned a moment ago. But in quite the contrasting turn of events, it would not be a quick pit stop like days past, which would mostly play into the massive damper on the other things I wanted to try to do to the east. We knew that rail action would slow down a bit for the day we would spend down here, but we certainly were not expecting it to die down as much as it did. After a roughly 6 a.m. arrival and a 10 to 15 minute hike down from my truck, we would sit back here for almost 2.5 hours before even so much as a peep on the radio. Well, that would be until westbound manifest train M331 would break the silence on this mundane Wednesday morning, and even sporting a little treat to somewhat make up for the extensive wait. As our day's first train finally rolls by, let's go ahead and point out a couple things, starting out with the lash-up. Sporting the Pan Am Railway's heritage unit taken off of the previous day's M316 at Cumberland, M331 is daily manifest freight from Cumberland, Maryland to Avon, Indiana. That being said, the entire motive consist of today's 331 would actually be a turn and burn from the 316 that got into Cumberland the night before. This would make for our second heritage unit of the trip, and also the second one in less than 24 hours. As for the train itself, upon its traditional routing, it would be very Captain Obvious of me to point out how slow he's moving through this scene, and nothing more than a gradual crawl. The common theme we would see with this train and the one that would end up following behind it would ultimately become a common sight throughout the next few days. This is peak mountain railroading at its absolute finest, and the one thing that a lot of these trains would have in common throughout the rest of our trip is all motive power would be cranked to the max and on their knees as they rumble the treacherous and steep slopes through tunnels and winding curves throughout the Allegheny Mountains. And helping these two big blue GEs get their heavy train up to the top of the hill was another CSX wide cab GE. But once this train was gone, it was gone, and no other trains were close by on the main line in either direction once again. In fact, it would be almost another hour and a half before anything else came up on the radar. Our first and only iteration of a new series of intermodals. Rumbling up the gradient with two more unmistakable big blue GE wide cabs was westbound I-117. New daily domestic intermodal containers and trailers from Baltimore, Maryland to Bedford Park, Illinois. In an attempt to launch new intermodal service to and from the Northeast, I-117 and its counterpart I-018 were recently instated as experimental trains to connect the ports of Baltimore in the Northeast to various points in the Midwest and Southeast, such as Chicago, Illinois, Atlanta, Georgia, and even Jacksonville, Florida, just to name a few of the big ones. Safe to say that the two trains that were added up here in the Northeast have been running rather smoothly for the most part. Well, at least the ones that we saw while we were around. And once again, these two big blue CSX GE wide cab builds provided a pretty bland power set. But as you can imagine, by this point of the morning, we were happy to be seeing anything at all. Once this I-117 got by, it would ironically or unironically go right back to the way it was for the last 3.5 hours. Fortunately, the wait for our final train at Falls Cut would not be as harrowing. This time we would wait for only another 30 minutes or so after this one rear marker lights got by, before Amtrak's southbound Floridian number 41 would come gracing out of the east portal of the Falls Cut Tunnel, thus finally giving me the shot that I came down here for. But once the Floridian was gone, We had no idea the level of silence we were in for. Once the Floridian was gone, we would drive around Cumberland pretty aimlessly for the rest of the morning and through much of the afternoon, because alas, there really wasn't much of anything happening anywhere. We would drive down to the Cumberland Hump Yard and find a few interesting things, but again, there was hardly anything going on the main line or even in the yard for that matter, and go figure that it would stay that way until we checked into our hotel. Likely track work all up and down the main line would be the reason for this, but even so, a dud of a day in comparison to what I had expected, especially with some of the other things that I had wanted to do to the east. So we would settle down in downtown Cumberland for a short time, after aimlessly driving around for much of the afternoon. Finally, at around 4:30 in the evening, eastbound manifest train M332 would be the train to finally break a grueling 6-hour silence around the entire Cumberland terminal. To put into perspective how much more active the main line was while we were still up in Pittsburgh, we had only seen 3 trains the entire morning, and then there was nothing for the next 6 hours. No horn, or even so much as a peep on the radio anywhere. And to bear in mind that this is the same main line up to Pittsburgh and beyond. But within that downtime, we did find both of the CSX America 250 locomotives down in the locomotive shops, as well as an old Dash 8 still wearing its original YN2 paint. But other than that, there was really nothing much of anything else going on anywhere at all. And even driving around town just to see what else we could find, there was almost nothing even then. So I checked into the hotel and grabbed some food during the down period since I hadn't eaten much of anything by this point of the day. And even though there was another eastbound lined up right behind this 332, it was already almost 5 p.m., and still with an early drive back to central Pennsylvania the following morning, we'd call it a day after this last eastbound got by. International Port Stack I-136. This would be our last train of day 3 for a number of reasons. Number 1, it was getting hot out and almost unbearable to sit outside waiting on trains in this excessive heat wave stretching across much of the Northeast. There really hadn't been much of anything happening on the main line pretty much all day, and I still needed to get all of my stuff packed up and ready for the early hour-and-a-half drive back up to central Pennsylvania. I needed some rest before the next 3 days, knowing full well what was in store for me. The heat wasn't dying down and the trains just weren't running. And with that, I'm going to end part 1 of this little series here. Stay tuned for part 2, as there will be plenty of stuff in store amongst our trek over the Norfolk Southern Pittsburgh line, which would end up being our primary focal point of the trip. And so, this is Ryan Farkos of the Volunteer State Rails signing off from Cumberland, Maryland, and I'll see y'all back in the Keystone State for parts 2 and 3 of the series for this trip.